Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and in today's discussion show, we'll be looking at developments between Israel, Iran, and the United States. The annual policy conference of the biggest pro-Israel lobbying group in the US, AIPAC, is usually dominated by the Palestinian question. Not so this year. In fact, you would be forgiven for thinking there was only one issue on the agenda: Iran and its alleged quest to acquire nuclear weapons. Tehran says it is enriching uranium for peaceful purposes. Israelis fear Iran is building doomsday weapons and will come good on a pledge to wipe Israel off the map. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is understood to be planning a strike on Iranian nuclear facilities. But he wants support from US President Barack Obama, who says he is loath to get involved in another Middle Eastern conflict. So, what have we learned from this week's AIPAC meetings about their positions? Is Iran really building nuclear bombs? And, if so, who has the right to try and stop them? And are peace talks between Israelis and Palestinians really off the table? To probe these big questions, we're hosting a debate in our London studios. I'm joined by Matthew Harris, a pro-Israeli Liberal Democrat, Rosemary Hollis, a Middle East expert from City University, John Rees from the self-explanatory Stop the War Coalition, and over the phone from Moscow by the Middle East analyst Israel Shamir. Okay, to start the ball rolling, I want to get a single sentence answer from each of you on this question. Are we going to see military action against Iran this year? Matthew, perhaps you can start.
I very much hope not, because I hope that sanctions will take such effect that military action will not be necessary.
And Rosemary?
My sense this week is that it's more likely than I believed a couple of weeks ago.
Okay, and John?
The substance of the discussions between the Israeli Prime Minister and the American President were about when, not if, there would be an attack on Iran. So if not this year, then shortly afterwards.
And Israel, to you in Moscow?
Well, I feel hopeful that no military action will come because it will lead eventually to world war.
Okay, so there seems to be a sense of caution from all of you. Matthew, you said you hope not, but you think it's plausible, possible. Can you go a bit further?
Yes, the commentary I've been reading in the newspapers suggests that Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, is one of those Israelis who is actually most undecided on whether or not a military strike against Iran should become necessary. The position of the UK government very much appears to be that military action is extremely to be regarded as a last resort, which we desperately hope can be avoided. And I obviously very much agree with that, because there are very strong sanctions which will hopefully persuade Iran to abandon its nuclear program. And what is good news is that there appear to be talks in the offing between Iran and the 5 UN Security Council members plus Germany.
I would like to pick up this point about last resort. My fear is that if you use the term, it's very much a last resort that force would be used, you give the impression that a military strike on Iran would actually eliminate their nuclear program. But that's far from clear from all the assessments, including the wargaming that's taken place in Washington over the last couple of years. The more likely outcome of a military strike on Iran is the damaging, the regression of its nuclear program, not its elimination. And the nasty secret lurking behind that, and the suspicion of the Iranians, is that a strike on Iran would be designed to destabilize the regime in hopes of regime change, and that would be the way to deal with the nuclear program, not actually physically with a military strike.
And John, your organisation, Stop the War Coalition, it's pretty clear what you believe, but what's your main thrust of your argument?
Well, it's clear that a strike on Iran would not be simply the end of the matter, as, say, the Libyan raid was in the 1980s. It would have massive consequences. There would be retaliation from the Iranians in the Gulf of Hormuz and wider in the Middle East. It would draw in other powers, both in the region and elsewhere, and it would be the beginning of a conflict which would put the Iraq war into the shadows.
And Israel, you were saying something even more serious than that. You even used the phrase, could start a world war.
In my view, we should not view all these things as something that happens only in the Middle East. There are very important new developments. And the ball is not only between Washington and Tel Aviv. In Moscow, there are very dramatic developments just now. As we know, there were elections, and Prime Minister Putin is to become a president. He is a man of very definite opinions on this subject, and he actually wrote a few days ago that Iran should be allowed to proceed with its nuclear program. And moreover, Russia insists that Iran should be entitled and all the sanctions should be removed from Iran. Now, it's not a very small thing that Russia and China, which contain the bigger landmass of Eurasia, are of this opinion. That is an opinion that should be actually considered very cautiously by all the sides involved.
I wonder if you could clarify when you said the forthcoming, again, President Putin is very much in favor of the Iranians continuing their nuclear program. The Europeans and officially the American administration are not against them having a nuclear program. They're against them having a nuclear weapon. And if the Iranians can convince the rest of the world that their program is for purely civil energy generation purposes and some research, then there's no question of taking out the program.
Well, we all lived through Iraqi war and the liberations that went to Iraqi war. And we know that the Europeans and the Americans were not convinced that Iraq hasn't got nuclear weapons. Iraq was destroyed, millions of people were killed, the country was totally devastated, there were no nuclear nor any other weapons of any sort. Now, for Israel, it's not a question of nuclear weapons of Iran at all. Israel wants Iran devastated. Full stop. Israel wants Iran to go the same way Iraq went.
But surely it's Iran. It's Iran that's threatened to wipe Israel off the map, not vice versa.
Oh, not at all. Even yesterday, Netanyahu said that in the future map there will be no Lebanon.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're hosting a discussion on Israel, Iran, and the United States. I'm joined by John Rees from the Stop the War Coalition, Matthew Harris, a pro-Israeli Liberal Democrat, Rosemary Hollis, a Middle East expert from City University, and over the line from Moscow by the Middle East analyst Israel Shamir. Now, of course, Obama and Netanyahu have been meeting in Washington on the sidelines of the AIPAC summit. I just want to play you some comments from the Israeli Prime Minister, and then we can analyze exactly what it is that came out of his mouth.
Israel has waited, patiently waited, for the international community to resolve this issue. We've waited for diplomacy to work. We've waited for sanctions to work. None of us can afford to wait much longer. As Prime Minister of Israel, I will never let my people live in the shadow of annihilation. Today we have a state of our own. And the purpose of the Jewish state is to defend Jewish lives and to secure the Jewish future.
Okay, Matthew, that was the point that you were raising there, the suggestion that for Israel, this is a matter of survival.
I think it is, that what he's saying is that Iran has expressed genocidal ambitions towards the state of Israel. Recent Jewish history within many people's living memory shows that genocide is not an idea to be taken lightly if you're Jewish. And he is using rhetoric to demonstrate, to remind the world of how urgent and serious this problem is. I would say that the sanctions that the EU, including the UK,
is the only nuclear power in the Middle East.
Just to finish my sentence.
Why is it that Israel is the only nuclear power in the Middle East? Why doesn't he say, look, my people are living in the shadow of annihilation because I've developed nuclear weapons in this country? That's what he should have said.
Because Israel's development of nuclear weapons is not the reason that Israel is threatened by annihilation from Iran.
Of course. But if Barack Obama says, look, the danger of the Iranians developing a nuclear weapon is that there might be a Cold War arms race in the Middle East. Of course, the fact that Israel already has these weapons, that it's the only country in the Middle East that's attacked every country with which it borders, of course that's a significant fact. You can't just dismiss that.
Israel has not attacked every country with which it borders.
It's attacked Lebanon, it's attacked Syria, it's attacked Jordan, and it's attacked Egypt.
I see that you're a liberal on criminal justice because you believe in short sentences because you keep interrupting.
I believe in a fairness of debate and not allowing people to simply assert things without contradiction when they're wrong.
Let me actually sort of finish the thought that I was trying to finish. The reason Israel has nuclear weapons is because it's surrounded by countries that don't recognise don't recognise its existence, don't recognise its existence,
don't have nuclear weapons.
Could you please stop trying to shout me down? Israel is surrounded by countries who don't recognise its existence and regularly threaten its destruction. It's kind of understandable that a country in that situation would choose to have a nuclear deterrent.
John, I want to put a question to you. Do you believe that Iran is seeking to acquire a nuclear weapon? Do you think that could be a threat? And how do you suggest resolving that issue?
Well, I know that the IEA say that it's developing a civilian nuclear capacity, but not a military capacity. If it were seeking to do that, I would regard that as regrettable. I believe that the only effective way out of that kind of impasse would be if there were a nuclear-free Middle East and the Americans used their decisive influence with the Israelis to get them to quit their nuclear weapons program. But at the end of the day, the very last people in the world who should be lecturing other states about whether they should develop nuclear weapons is the one country that's actually used a nuclear weapon in anger, and that's the United States.
And seeing as we've got onto the United States, obviously, I want to play you a second comment, and this comes from President Barack Obama, and this was also made in Washington over the last couple of days.
Our commitment to the security of Israel is rock solid. And my policy here is not going to be one of containment. My policy is prevention of Iran obtaining nuclear weapons. And as I indicated yesterday in my speech, when I say all options are at the table, I mean it. We do believe that there is still a window that allows for a diplomatic resolution to this issue, but ultimately the Iranian regime has to make a decision to move in that direction, a decision that they have not made thus far.
Okay, Rosemary, I'll put that one over to you. I want to get a reaction to you on what Obama was saying there. What can we infer from what Washington is really thinking here?
I think one of the worrying aspects of this whole situation is that the Iran issue is being used as a weapon in the presidential election primaries. And all the Republican candidates to run against Obama are suggesting that he's being too weak on the subject of Iran and professing profound support for Israel. Now, I think there's a very good case that can be made that the best thing that could happen to Israel is not necessarily an attack on Iran. And the other difficulty here is what I alluded to before. Insofar as Obama enters into diplomacy with Iran, with sanctions squeezing the Iranian regime, designed to hurt it, it's not going to work, this diplomacy, unless there's some kind of attraction, face-saving attraction for Iran if it agrees to demonstrate that its nuclear program is purely for civilian purposes. And one of the reasons why that attractive incentive to go along with productive negotiations is absent is because of the Republican Party candidates' pressure on Obama as a political ploy in an election campaign that has absolutely nothing to do with the Middle East.
You talk about the politicization of this issue in America. We've heard the statements from the Republican candidates, quite hawkish, but Barack Obama has, of course, responded to them, and we'll just play what he said here.
We have a window of opportunity where this can still be resolved diplomatically. That's not just my view. That's the view of our top intelligence officials. It's the view of top Israeli intelligence officials. What's said on the campaign trail, those folks don't have a lot of responsibilities. They're not commander-in-chief. And when I see the casualness with which some of these folks talk about war, I'm reminded of the costs involved in war.
Now, John, given your anti-war position, you must have taken some kind of comfort in what Obama was saying there.
Well, I think President Obama was trying to relieve the pressure on him from the Republican right over the question of Iran for the reasons that Rosemary gave. But I don't actually think that this is a secure guide to the White House's intentions here. You see, look, if there were serious negotiations going on, we would have had, in the last 3 years, there have been 45 minutes, just 45 minutes of face-to-face negotiations between the Americans and the Iranians. Now, that tells you exactly what they expect from the sanctions. They expect the sanctions not to work, and when the sanctions have been seen to work, they think that this will provide a sufficient base in public opinion for a military raid on the facility. So I don't take the Obama discussion, which I take to be one of timing, not of direction, with Netanyahu to be really a fundamental difference.
And Israel, maybe throwing that one over to you. From what you just heard from Obama, how hawkish do you believe his position really is?
I must say that in Israel, the prevailing view today is that Netanyahu came back to Israel empty-handed. That is actually the headline of Haaretz today. So Israelis see that Netanyahu did not obtain from Obama what he wanted. The difference between the two can be defined in few words. Netanyahu insists that Iran should stop all nuclear program that could possibly lead to development of nuclear weapons. Obama speaks about something different. He speaks about actually developing nuclear weapons. In other words, it's two different positions. One of them saying that Iran should not have a potential to develop. That's Israeli position. And the American position is that he should not develop. It sounds like very similar, but it is two very different ways. In other words, for Israel, Obama is not sufficiently hawkish on Iran. And that is why, for sure, there would be a pressure to push him more and more.
That was a really interesting comment there, and I want to throw it over to Matthew. Mr. Shamir was saying that Israel is playing a silly game by pushing Washington into this war. Do you see it that way?
No, I don't. I don't think that Israel is trying to push the United States into a war. I think what Israel is trying to do is work with the United States to exert as much pressure as possible to prevent the development of a nuclear weapon. I mean, if I was Benjamin Netanyahu and I was sat at his desk and I heard that sanctions had succeeded and there was no longer the possibility of an Iranian nuclear weapon without a shot having to be fired in anger, I imagine I would be delighted.
Rosemary is shaking her head, though.
I think it depends which Israelis you're talking about. And there's no very good relationship between Netanyahu and Obama. And there is a difference between some of the politicians in Israel, how they feel about the virtues of a strike on Iran, and that would inevitably bounce the United States into involvement, versus some of the intelligence types who've worked out that it could be very counterproductive. So I think what we're afraid of here is some elements winning the day because of a lot of different power struggles, both in America and in Israel and in the region of the Middle East, and for that matter, inside Tehran.
And John, you want to get something in here?
Yes, well, I think that's an important point about the effect of sanctions, because it's not just the American election that's going on. There's just been an election in Iran. And although President Ahmadinejad's supporters did less well in that, it would be a mistake, I think, that to read that result as in some way a softening of the pressure to resist the sanctions regime, because Ayatollah Khatami's supporters did very well. He's in charge of the foreign policy. He's the one that's as resistant to American pressure. So I don't think that's a particularly good sign that the sanctions regime is going to produce a change of heart in Tehran. The other thing that I think is very important to realise about this situation, about the pressure that exists for a drive to war, is that a lot of the American foreign policy's determination to deal with the growing regional power of Iran is to do with their failure in Iraq. The failure in Iraq produced willy-nilly, the unintended consequence was to create an even more powerful regional influence for Iran. And that is something which, whatever the differences of timing with Israel, the Americans are not going to let stand forever.
It's worth remembering that the election in Iran that just happened was an election in which different strands of pro-regime conservative were standing, and reformists who opposed the regime were actually barred from standing. Exactly. I do agree with John that a consequence of the Iraq war has been that what one could almost call a bulwark against Iran's regional ambitions, in other words, a strong regime in Iraq, has been removed, which is not to say that I wish that Saddam Hussein was still there, but nevertheless we now have a much weaker Iraq in military terms right on Iran's doorstep.
And you do have some analysts in Washington who know Iran from the inside before making their homes in Washington, advocating leaving well alone because internal divisions in Iran could well produce the kind of regime change that some of the sabotage campaigns that we've had, in addition to sanctions, perpetrated by the Americans, and one assumes Israel too, so far, has been. to see a change in Tehran. But if you attack from the outside, we know the natural tendency is to close ranks.
Yes, and there are many people, even in the Green movement, even in the opposition movement, who will tell you now, I am absolutely opposed to the regime, but I am absolutely opposed to any foreign intervention, and I will stand with Ahmadinejad and Khatami if there's an attack on Iran. It's absolutely self-evident that that's the case.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're hosting a discussion on Israel, Iran, and the United States. I'm joined by John Rees from the Stop the War Coalition, Matthew Harris, a pro-Israeli Liberal Democrat, Rosemary Hollis, a Middle East expert from City University, and over the line from Moscow by the Middle East analyst Israel Shamir. Now, I didn't want to have such a good group of talkers in the room without getting onto one final issue today. As I mentioned at the outset, AIPAC is usually a conference to deal with the Israel-Palestinian issue. And I've got a question about that, which I'm going to put first of all over to you, Mr. Shamir. A few months back, the Palestinians were seizing the initiative. They were heading to the Security Council of the United Nations with a bid for statehood. But now it's sort of off the agenda and they're on the back foot again. What went wrong?
The problem is that now there are so many positions that are in the hands of the United States. The United States succeeded to manipulate the United Nations into stopping this item of agenda. This is one of those really awful things which make us all doubt about efficiency of the United Nations. It is really awfully pity that the Secretary General of the United Nations, instead of doing his duty and passing it for deliberations, succeeded to stop it from doing it.
And Matthew, Mr. Shamir is saying it's a failure of the UN, but really it's a failure of Netanyahu. He's just not interested in making peace with the Palestinians, is he?
I think what's interesting is that sometimes pro-Palestinian people accuse Mr. Netanyahu of not being interested in peace, and then pro-Israeli people sometimes accuse the Palestinians of not being interested in peace, and sometimes, frankly, there's possibly an element of truth in both allegations. Having said that, Benjamin Netanyahu has said repeatedly that he would talk today, he would get in his car and drive to Ramallah to speak to President Abbas if Mr. Abbas agreed to Prime Minister Netanyahu's offer of unconditional talks. I'm not saying it's that simple. There's things that the Israeli government could do to make it easier for President Abbas and the Palestinians to come into talks, and it's very frustrating that the talks that were in Amman in Jordan in January 2012 did not reach greater fruition. But I do believe that the only way peace is going to be achieved is not through unilateral declarations at the United Nations, but through long, tough negotiations involving painful compromises on both sides. And that's going to involve a responsible attitude being taken by Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Abbas. And I would argue that both of them, especially Mr. Abbas, need to do everything they can to bring about renewed talks.
I don't think the premise of the question is actually right, that the Palestinians are in a weaker position now. And I think you have to look at the impact of the Arab revolutions to understand this. For a start off, Hamas and Fatah are in the process of gluing back together, whatever you think about the terms on which they're doing it, a united Palestinian movement, which is one thing. The second impact of the Arab revolutions is that it's removed Egypt as an effective ally of Israel, and any possible or conceivable Egyptian government will be more pro-Palestinian and less pro-Israeli than the Mubarak regime was. It's detached Turkey because Turkey wants to become a bridgehead for the European powers and others into the Arab region, and part of the price that it's paying is a more robust attitude towards the state of Israel. So I don't actually take the view that the Palestinians are in a weaker position than they were before certainly the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt.
I would pick up the point that AIPAC normally in its conferences concentrates on the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. Actually, they've always seen the Palestinian problem, from Israel's point of view, in a regional context. It's always been part of a wider Arab landscape, and Iran has always been there in the background. You had Yitzhak Rabin intoning against Iran as the main danger to Israel, even if it made peace with the Palestinians. But I happen to be one of those people who think there's no mileage left in the two-state formula because the West Bank is gone.
Okay, that was Rosemary Hollis, a Middle East expert from City University, saying the dream of a two-state solution for Israel-Palestine is gone. I was also joined by John Rees from the Stop the War Coalition, Matthew Harris, a pro-Israeli Liberal Democrat, and over the line from Moscow by the Middle East analyst Israel Shamir. You're listening to The Voice of Russia. I'm James Reinl. Stay tuned. We'll be back shortly.